Well, Siddharth, it's really good to see you again. I hope you're still keeping well.
Likewise, Rodney, good to see you. Yes, thank you, all well.
Good. So last time we talked about the challenges in the taxation of the digitalized economy. I wanted to come back to you, Siddharth, because of course there's a whole other dimension to the world in India, and that's relating to incentives for manufacturing. So coming to the manufacturing side today, tell me, how is the Indian government supporting the Make in India policy through tax measures, say incentives or reforms?
So, Rodney, in fact, this current government, which has been now, in power for quite a few years, this is the second term running now for this government. Its area of focus right from the beginning has been to increase the percentage of GDP derived from manufacturing activities to a substantial level. This has been their focus. As you know, and as it's known world over, India has been a champion economy in terms of export of services, whether it is computer software, back office, IT-enabled services, and so on. But really, the government's focus was to ensure that manufacturing comes up to a reasonably high level, supporting real jobs, real economy, and also I think the fact that the post-pandemic revival is something that is throwing up opportunities in light of supply chains being rejigged, and maybe a bit of geopolitics, maybe a bit of de-risking strategies. Who have all their factories in China, for example, they may want to look at expanding or setting up shop manufacturing facilities in India. So the government is abreast of these opportunities and has in fact been introducing measures. We've seen a spate of reform, frankly, in the last couple of years to boost and encourage manufacturing in particular. I would like to maybe just give an overview about the 2 or 3 important changes that have happened. First up, the corporate tax rate for new manufacturing companies has been brought down to 15%, and this is something significantly lower than as the world knows, India's headline corporate tax rate was almost 35%, a few years ago. So a 15% rate for a new manufacturing company is something that is really significantly lower, and shows the government's intent to become really competitive. The other important reform that happened in 2020 was with regards to taxation of dividends, and this really benefited the Indian companies with foreign shareholding, because the reform in the taxation of dividends allowed the foreign shareholders to frankly apply the treaty rate for taxation of dividends, which earlier was not possible because the tax was on the company distributing the dividend and the shareholder was exempt from taxation. So these 2 reforms, going hand in hand, brought down the effective tax rate from very high, almost late 40s, now down to effectively in the late 20s. So for a new manufacturing company in particular. So this really brought a significant competitive edge from a tax standpoint to new manufacturing companies on the direct tax side.
That's really interesting stuff, because that's a substantial reduction in the headline corporate tax rate and really brings India into line with a lot of other jurisdictions looking to incentivize manufacturing. Now, I'm guessing with reform, there's always ambiguities or certain lack of clarity. What else still needs to be done, in your view, to bring clarity or certainty so that people continue to establish manufacturing in India?
Right, Rodney. So I think, working closely with clients, whether domestic or multinational, the problems and the issues are fundamentally the same. That the first and foremost, I think the reforms that have been brought about with regard to new manufacturing, there is some ambiguity around certain aspects. So, for example, one of the things that is not clear is that if you have a company which is doing only manufacturing and some other ancillary activities, let's say a bit of distribution and trading on the side, there are no thresholds provided, and those companies, as the law stands, become completely disqualified for this this rate. So this is something that is a little bit absurd, because business models are dynamic, and manufacturing companies may trade in some products before they actually develop the capabilities to manufacture them. So, and there are no thresholds provided. So some of these things are limiting in their nature and need to be clarified. The other sort of thing that I feel is missing, and this is from my experience in talking to colleagues from other jurisdictions, particularly in the developing economies such as Mexico and others, is that in India we don't still have a unified sort of framework which allows a consignment manufacturing or a toll manufacturing where products can be manufactured in India for exclusively purposes of export under a consignment manufacturing model. We have exchange control regulations of the central bank and other indirect tax complications which could come in the way of a pure play consignment manufacturing / toller model, which I think is not something that is enabled yet in the Indian legislative framework. And lastly, perhaps from a tax certainty perspective, I think the advance ruling mechanism which India has adopted is right now not working in a timely fashion. It's taking too long to get advance rulings out, and even after the advance rulings are pronounced, we are seeing tax authorities sometimes challenge those in court furthermore. So the whole concept of advance ruling as in India, which at one point was pretty effective, it seems to have lost its sheen. So I would say those are some of the areas that we need to focus on a little bit more to attract manufacturing investments. And last but not the least, I would say also on the indirect tax side and the custom duty related regime, there also perhaps some things could additionally be done in terms of custom duty waivers and deferment schemes, especially for export-oriented units, where they could very easily kind of bring in raw material and products for processing without payment of custom duty if they're eventually going to be exported. So I think those are the areas where perhaps something more can be done, or if there's something already there, it could be made bureaucratically more easy to implement, perhaps. That's what I would say.
So that's interesting, Siddharth. And, I was particularly interested in your comment around the question of thresholds and how perhaps undertaking some ancillary businesses could inadvertently disqualify someone from their expected incentive benefits. That surely has to be a trap for the unwary, because people are consolidating operations into fewer legal entities these days due to COVID. So it will be very interesting to watch that space. And it is, I guess, a great reminder to folk that attention to detail is really important when you're trying to seek incentives, and having policies and procedures that govern that. So very interesting, Siddharth. One last question while I've got you. There's a lot of talk about how the inclusive framework will accommodate tax incentives. And again, a little bit of crystal ball gazing, but what is your view on that as we look forward to the next several years of global taxation change?
Right. I think that's a good question, Rodney. And, I think from an Indian tax reform perspective, while there has been a global race to the bottom in the recent years, but I think India still remains a developing economy, and tax rates ultimately are, while they are low for certain sectors, ultimately they are still well above the minimum thresholds for all sectors as well as all operations. Uh, and also, in light of these tax rate cuts and reforms, we've seen progressively, all the tax holidays being phased out, and a lot of incentives, including special economic zone related incentives, being phased out due to sunset clauses and other WTO commitments, etc. So, in a sense, perhaps except for one or two very specific offshore financial services regime related provisions where there is still a tax holiday left, there are no more sort of zero tax regime or holidays or sectors available in India right now. At the same time, India does have a stringent source rule taxation in the domestic law, as well as with most of its countries based on the UN model, as opposed to the OECD model. And hence, most of the, payments which are effectively either related party or third party, which are, deductible expenses, which are payments overseas, are subject to a withholding tax already. So to that extent, I would say purely from an Indian perspective, while there would be an impact for cross-border structures of interacting with India, but purely from an Indian tax standpoint, I don't really see a huge impact in terms of India losing any revenues from the inclusive framework. It would only gain revenues if from the inclusive framework if it's implemented in its current proposal.
Well, really interesting, Siddharth, because as people set up manufacturing, they're always looking to the midterm and the long term, right? Because of the scale of the investment. And I'm sure that's very comforting as people think about the ongoing viability of some of these regimes, the lower corporate tax rate, that it may not be impacted by the inclusive framework. Time will tell, so we will know, but that's very comforting.
Yeah, that's a good point, Rodney. In fact, the 15% rate does not have a sunset clause. So that's something that global investors will be happy to know.
Yeah. So, Siddharth, it was just great to see you again. And please stay healthy during these uncertain times.
You too, Rodney. Take care.